And good evening, everyone. My name is Evan Weiner, and I am no stranger to the Philadelphia area. And thank Matt for inviting me to the Phoenixville Library for the talk on radio tonight. As I said, I'm no stranger to Philadelphia. I have spoken at Temple University. I have spoken also at Widener College, Widener University down in Chester, along with St. Joe's, over on West Philadelphia by Channel 10. And I think Channel 10 is over there now, and I think Channel 3 is over there as well. So thank you for inviting me. This talk came out of something that I did in 1978. I was on radio as a 15-year-old in 1971 at WRKL in Mount Ivy, New York, doing a show for Spring Valley High School called Tiger Talk. And between 15 and say 22, 1978, I was working in newspapers, doing some radio, doing some other stuff. And I was working in a radio station called WGRC Radio in Nanuet, New York. And every Sunday afternoon at 12 o'clock, we had a 2-hour block. And it was called Radio, the Theater of the Imagination. And I had known of Jack Benny because of television. I knew of Burns and Allen because of television. But I never heard them on radio. I never had an opportunity to hear them on radio. And for 2 hours every Sunday, we would play The Benny Show or Burns and Allen or Inner Sanctum or The Shadow, Lamont Cranston, and play all that. And I get to thinking, you know, not only were the performers talented, but the people who wrote that had to crank out things, stuff after stuff after stuff after stuff. And it got me very interested. After all, I had started in radio when I was 15, and I always wanted to be in radio back when I was 4 or 5 years old. That, hey, you know what? Let me take a look at all this. And I ended up doing news. I was on WNEW in New York doing some stringing news. That was a station of William B. Williams, who gave Frank Sinatra the nickname Chairman of the Board. But looking at radio, when did radio become important? Well, you could say 1926 when David Sarnoff started NBC Radio, but people found out the real importance of radio on Gate Night or Devil Night in 1938 in New Jersey because of Orson Welles. Orson Welles in the Mercury Theater put on a drama. It was called The War of the Worlds. It was an adaptation of the H.G. Wells book, War of the Worlds, which I'm sure you have in the library. And he came on and he told the audience, this is a drama. Nothing is real. This is a drama. But the problem was people tuning in late if they missed the first 15, 20 seconds of the show. And it was done in a style where there were a lot of bulletins. There was a ballroom show back in the early days of radio. Every town had a local ballroom show with a big band and dancing and all. And Wells sets this thing up as a ballroom dance show and keeps cutting in with these bulletins. The Martians have invaded the Earth, and the Martians are over in Grover Mill, New Jersey. Not too far from Princeton. And at that point, people started getting really scared of what was going on. About 8-9 years ago, I was doing this talk in Nyack, New York, and there was a guy who was in his late 80s or so, something like that. And he was living in Princeton, New Jersey, and they had the radio on. And his father told the kids, go to the garage, get the shovels, get the rakes. You're going to have to hit these people over the head. You're going to have to hit them. Because when they come, who knows what they're going to do? And he said he and his brothers and sisters ran down to the garage to get the rakes and the shovels to fight the Martians. And they weren't the only ones. Around the country, people were doing that. Now, why did this become this way? Well, the show started in the middle of the Edgar Bergen show. Edgar Bergen, Candace Bergen's father. And he was one of the most popular people on radio at that time. And the show was a half hour into when the Bergen show ended. It was a half hour into this show, and people tuned to the show and they heard about what was going on. Obviously, it was radio, and people didn't realize that. Wells made it sound so real that they thought that the Martians did invade the Earth. In fact, people would be calling up CBS show, and they called up CBS and they said, what's going on? What can we do? They were calling their local police departments. What could we do? Wells had the actors on the show go to the switchboard. Remember old switchboards? They don't exist anymore. And they would be answering phones saying, this is only a drama. It's not real. It's only a drama. Police were mobilizing around the country because they didn't know what was going on. They kept getting calls from people saying, the Martians are coming. The Martians are coming. Now, how did this show develop? Well, actually, the BBC did a similar show in 1926. Orson Welles said he had conceived of the idea of doing a radio broadcast in such a manner that a crisis would actually seem to be happening. And there is Welles after the show explaining to the New York media and the national media what went right, what went wrong. What went right, people believe radio was actually presenting something. What went right, radio becomes really important, really, really important. More so than radio people thought. People actually sat around their radio and they listened to it intently. What went wrong, people believed it. The first 2/3 of the 1-hour broadcast was presented as a series of simulated news bulletins. So you'd have the music going and you'd have the guy saying, and the next number is this, and all of a sudden somebody would cut in and say, the Martians are now in Grover Mill, New Jersey, and they're getting closer and closer. Why did they pick Grover Mill? I have no idea. Maybe it's halfway between New York and Philadelphia. In the end, it was only a radio show. And in the end, people were afraid of Marvin the Martian. But it did cause quite a stir with people. And they looked at radio differently after that. Orson Welles did change radio. Radio was more than entertainment. It could give you a lot of information. But radio was conceived as an information-bearing medium way back when. People used to sit in front of the radio and listen to the radio. And I've had people who said, oh, I was that little girl. I sat and watched the radio. I watched it. What were you going to see? There was no picture, but you watched it. Why'd you watch it? Theater of the imagination. When you hear something, you have to concentrate it. When you watch TV, well, your concentration can drag off. You don't have to concentrate on every little bit. But if you want to catch everything on radio, you have to concentrate. I learned this when I went to Ramapo College back in the 1970s. I had a teacher by the name of Jim McCarthy, who actually was a Broadway vocal coach. Paul Michael Glazier was his most famous student. And he had me watch and listen to the Kennedy-Nixon debates of 1960. I can tell you, if you watch that debate and if you listen to that debate, it was two separate debates. You listened, you really listened. You watched Kennedy because Kennedy was impossible to take your eye off. That is Signal Hill. That is in St. John, Newfoundland. I speak on cruise ships and I have seen a lot of ports in my life. And Signal Hill is where radio actually starts. In 1901, Marconi is there. The first transatlantic wireless transmission from Cornwall in the UK to Newfoundland. That was December 12th, 1901, 119 years ago. Radio worked. And there's my old Grundig radio from the 1950s. I don't even play this anymore because it has tubes. I don't know where you would get tubes. So it just sits there and it's a conversation piece. United States Radio, though, was not born in the United States. It was born on April 15th, 1912 in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Now, when I'm live, I usually ask, well, what happened that day? Well, what happened that day was the sinking of the Titanic, and the SOSs that came out of the ship reached Manhattan. There was a guy by the name of David Sarnoff. David Sarnoff managed the Marconi wireless station at the John Wanamaker's department store in New York. There are no more Wanamakers in New York, nor is there a Wanamaker mile at the Milrose games anymore, which isn't even at Madison Square Garden anymore. Wanamaker's was a big deal, and the the Marconi wireless station was in the building or in the department store. The sinking of the Titanic brings radio into the public spotlight and prompts the United States Congress to regulate the medium. Basically what happened, Sarnoff is getting these SOSs from the Titanic. He's taking them down and relaying messages to families who had loved ones in the Titanic. And he goes out to Coney Island a couple of days later, continues doing that, and an idea comes in his head. Wow, if we could get a part of the spectrum, we could actually do something, and we could have radiola. We could actually do this. And he decides, after the sinking of the Titanic, as he said, the sinking of the Titanic brought me a lot of fortunate luck. And there is General Sarnoff, David Sarnoff. Eventually, his company, the Radio Corporation of America, would get the Marconi radio station from the U.S. Navy following World War I. Radio is born, but he doesn't start it. It is started in the Westinghouse Laboratories in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. George Westinghouse is working on it, and they're also working at it in Schenectady at the General Electric headquarters. November 2nd, 1920, KDKA, which you could get in Philadelphia, 1020 on the dial. We could get it here in New York. KDKA was the first licensed commercially broadcast station in the world. And Leo Rosenberg was the guy who was the announcer that night. And the first thing that they ever did was the Harding-Cox, Warren G. Harding, James Cox presidential election returns. That started at 6 p.m. And Rosenberg stayed on as long as he could until they got some results. And then he would give who won, which would be Harding eventually. It would take a couple of days. But radio really takes off in Jersey City on July 2nd, 1921. That's Jack Dempsey on the left. Jack Dempsey is fighting a guy by the name of Carpentier from France, and it was the biggest fight in the world at that point. It was done at a place called Boyle's 30 Acres. It was a temporary arena. It was a wooden arena. It would seat over 90,000. And this is where sports media fees would start, and also radio would start. Sarnoff had it all figured out for RCA. They're going to sell radios. But if you're going to sell a radio or a listening device, or a radiola as it was called, you had to give people a reason to buy the radio. You couldn't just have a radio play static. You couldn't do that. Sarnoff figured out, I got to put news on, I got to put music on, but he starts first with sports. On July 2nd, 1921, he arranges the broadcast of the Jack Dempsey-George Carpentier prize fight. Within 3 years of that fight, the radio music box, it was called the radiola, and it was $75 to buy a radio or a radiola, but it was a success. They had $83.5 million worth of sales in 1921, 22, 23, 24. But Sarnoff rolls the dice that he could get enough people interested in listening to this fight, which is only on KDKA in Pittsburgh, but its signal traveled to the Mississippi and east, up into New England, into Canada and south. People bought it for the fight. The Dempsey-Carpentier contest takes place July 2nd, 1921 in Jersey City. It was the first $1 million gate in boxing history. There was a crowd of 91,000 that watched the fight, and RCA arranged for a live coverage of the match, and that was kind of shaky that they got it on, but they did get it on, making the event the first national radio broadcast. It's generated a lot of interest in the radiola, and there is Dempsey, who he was kind of I wouldn't say a Muhammad Ali type character in 1921, but he was a guy who was accused of being a draft dodger because he was not in World War I, because he said he supported his family. And there were people who liked Dempsey, and there were people who did not like Dempsey because he didn't serve his country. Dempsey would win the fight, a 4-round knockout. It was scheduled for 12 rounds, but that wasn't the big story of the day. The big story of the day was the fight was successful on radio. But it wasn't the first fight on radio. Actually, KDKA did have the first fight 2 months earlier, or 3 months earlier, April 11th, 1921. It was a 10-round, no-decision fight between Johnny Ray and Johnny Dundee in Pittsburgh's Motor Square Garden. There is, look at Johnny Ray. Wow, he wasn't singing, crying at that point. Geez, he looks like such a tough guy, doesn't he? And look at those two guys holding that thing behind him. August 5th, 1921, continuing with the sports vein, there was some information, but sports, because they wanted to sell radios. The first game was done in Pittsburgh, KDKA, and it featured the Pittsburgh Pirates and the Philadelphia Phillies, August 5th, 1921. Warren G. Harding had a radiola. Warren G. Harding had a radiola installed in the White House. I wonder if somebody told the president, you don't have to stare into the cylinder. You could turn the other way and you could hear perfectly well what was going on. But a radio was installed in the White House on February 8th, 1922. 2 years later, Calvin Coolidge, who followed Harding, who passed away in 1923, Coolidge was the first president to broadcast from the White House. An old story about Coolidge from Art Modell, the former owner of the late owner of the Cleveland Browns and the Baltimore Ravens. He was telling me a story about what he had heard about Coolidge, who didn't say much. His nickname was Silent Cow. And he said that he heard the story about a woman who said, I'll bet you $5, President Coolidge, that I could get you to say 4 or 5 words. And he turned to her and said, you lose. Anyway, Coolidge's address was heard on Washington's birthday in 1922, February 22nd, 1922. And it was heard on 42 radio stations that went coast to coast. Keeping in the sports vein, because that's what David Sarnoff did. There is a station in New York, WEAF, 660 on the dial. And he gets the rights to the 1923 World Series, which featured the New York Giants and the New York Yankees, but he only gets it for one reason. That guy on the left, Babe Ruth, because Babe Ruth was one of the global stars at the time, with Charlie Chaplin and Jack Dempsey and the Babe, eventually Rudolph Valentino in the roaring 1920s. And people bought radios so they could hear the exploits of Babe Ruth. And maybe Babe Ruth would hit a home run. Maybe he wouldn't, but they listened to Babe Ruth. Calvin Coolidge, hey, this is cool. Look at Calvin Coolidge's car. Calvin Coolidge has a car. And on the side of that car, he's got a speaker. So he could listen to radio while he is driving around Washington, D.C. The night before the 1924 election, Calvin Coolidge makes history. The largest radio audience ever tunes in to hear the final campaign speech of his campaign, 1924. Coolidge would win the election. In March, on March 3rd, 1925, Americans listened for the first time to their president take the oath of office on radio. Say you're born in at that point before the Civil War. Radio had to be amazing, that it's in your house and you could hear the President of the United States talk right to you. And radio becomes very intimate to people because they're just looking and they're listening to the voice coming out of the radio. In 1926, Britain was appalled at David Sarnoff because David Sarnoff said, I'm going to go and get some advertisers. And I am going to sell advertising time to support my programming. While in Britain, they said, no, you'll get a license when you buy a radio, and some of that money will go to support the BBC. By 1934, Radio Luxembourg, which was instrumental in the Beatles becoming popular in the 1960s, did programming in Luxembourg, 200,000 watts of power blanketing Europe as early as 1934. In the 1920s, the United States would send programs around the world. And some of the United States programs were very popular in Argentina, particularly music. And why was that? Because there was a fight between Dempsey and Firpo for the Argentinian, and people bought radios to hear if Firpo could beat Jack Dempsey. Finally, in 1926, NBC, Three Little Tones, NBC Radio starts. And it wasn't just one network, it was two networks. The NBC Red, flagship network, which established shows and advertisers, and NBC Blue, which had sustaining shows or news shows. What if you had a radio in, say, 1933, what might you hear? Well, radio plays, mystery, adventure, detective series, soap operas, quiz shows, variety hours, talent shows. You might hear George Gershwin pop on Rudy Valley's show. You might hear Chico Marx. He had a show, he had a band. And the drummer in his band was Mel Torme. So you could hear a whole variety of things on radio, because if you were anybody in showbiz in the United States, you had a radio show or were constantly on radio. That's Bill Paley. Bill Paley founded CBS in Philadelphia. 1210 on your dial. The retired call letters WCAU, which legendary call letters don't exist anymore, which is too bad. WCAU in Philadelphia. The other NBC network had headlines. They had remote reporting. They had sidewalk interviews. They had panel discussions, weather reports, farm reports. And here in New York, we had a radio station, WABC, 770 on the dial, the All-Americans, they were called, or that's what they called themselves. And that was Bruce Morrow and Dan Ingram, some of the who's who of not only New York radio, but national radio as well, Cousin Brucey. And one day I was working at a radio station, little radio station. Charlie Greer was working for that station. And I asked him, how come WABC was doing farm reports, 50,000 watts, New York City, and they're doing farm reports at 3 in the morning? And he said, simply, we were trying to keep our license because we were going out towards Kansas and those areas. So we did the agriculture report to keep our license. This was WABC radio, playing the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the Turtles and everybody else in the 1960s. They wanted to keep their license, and they did farm reports in the middle of New York City. NBC's Red Network, their first broadcast, February 24th, 1930, Floyd Gibbons, who was a newspaper correspondent at the beginning of the 20th century, did some news for them. That was their first broadcast, was February 24th, 1930, of news. And there's Lowell Thomas. Lowell Thomas was also on NBC. Lowell Thomas made his name basically relating the stories of Lawrence of Arabia. Earlier than getting on radio. He starts on radio September 29, 1930. He was on CBS, Paley's station, WCAU in Philadelphia, and he worked for both CBS and NBC during his career. His radio program, Lowell Thomas in the news, usually ended with the words, "So long until tomorrow." Before Thomas became a radio commentator, he was a travel adventure writer, known best for his stories about Lawrence of Arabia. Also in the 1930s, he worked as the narrator for Fox Tone or Fox Movie Tone newsreels when they used to have those Saturday gatherings at the movie house with cartoons and shorts and movies, and Lowell Thomas giving you the news. He lasts until May 14th, 1976 on radio. And if you ever go up to Pawling, New York, there's a little plaque because that's where Lowell Thomas lived. That plaque is inside a rock talking about Lowell Thomas's career in radio. Jack Benny started radio in 1934. Jack Benny was one of the greatest radio shows ever. In fact, the biggest laugh ever recorded in radio history is the show where Jack Benny is at Ronald Coleman's house, his alleged next door neighbor in Beverly Hills. They knew each other, but they weren't neighbors. But the show purposes, they were neighbors. Mary Livingston, his long-suffering girlfriend, and Rochester, one of the most popular people on radio back in the 1930s and 1940s. The biggest laugh in radio ever is the show where Jack steals an Oscar out of Ronald Coleman's house, and he's walking back to his house, and Mel Blanc plays the role of a robber. And Mel Blanc says, hey, buddy, this is a stick-up. Your money or your life. I said this is a stick-up. Your money or your life. I'm thinking. Biggest laugh in radio. Everybody knew what was coming. Biggest laugh in radio. Everybody knew what was coming because on radio you had time to develop a character. The Benny character, well, he was fussy and he was vain and he was cheap and he had a funny walk and he was cheap and he was cheap and he was cheap. He was the biggest star in radio for about 20 years and then moved over to TV, and his TV shows weren't as good. The radio shows were really good. They were really good actresses and actors. There's Toscanini and there's George Gershwin. You can hear the Metropolitan Opera with Toscanini on NBC, or George Gershwin could pop on some show and play his latest song, I've Got Rhythm, all 15 variations of I've Got Rhythm. The oldest show on radio that's still going is from Nashville. That is a picture of Nashville from 2002 when I was in Nashville over the Christmas season, and we went to go see the Grand Ole Opry. But we got to see it in Reidman Auditorium, the old cathedral. The new place is in a mall north of the city. And the Grand Ole Opry started in 1929, and it's still going 91 years later. And I thought I would not like the show. I had such a good time. Porter Wagner was the host of the show, and little Jimmy Dickens was on, and it was really great. And it was a great experience sitting there for 4 hours watching the Grand Ole Opry, which is 91 years and going. Now, Superman. We kind of know that kryptonite is a problem for Superman, right? Superman has a problem. And so we do know that kryptonite could literally kill Superman. But do we know why it could kill Superman? Oh yeah, there's the explanation about the sun and radiation and all that. But that's the radio show explanation. So if you want to tell your grandkids something and they like the Superman series, you might want to take notes on this story. Superman was played by Bud Collyer, who did TV shows such as Beat the Clock and To Tell the Truth, did some beauty pageants, but he was first and foremost a radio voice actor. He had gone to Fordham Law School, didn't like law school, and he decided he was going to become a voice actor. After all, his sister June was an actress in the movies. That's getting a little ahead of ourselves, so let's slow down just a bit. The Adventures of Superman started after the comic came out, and it started on WOR Radio, 710 on your dial, February 12, 1940. Mutual Radio, I worked with Mutual Radio when it was in existence in the 1980s. Mutual Radio picks up the show on August 31st, 1942. It's the first broadcast. It would last for 7 years. Bud Collyer was doing a whole bunch of shows, and he was playing both Superman and Clark Kent on the show, different octaves in the voices. And a couple years into the, or a number of weeks into the show, year into the show, Bud said, "Hey, look, I need a vacation. Okay, I need a vacation. I'm doing all this work and all, we're successful, but I really need a vacation." And the producers of the show said, "Yeah, you know what? You're entitled to a vacation. Yeah, okay. But we got to do some figuring out here. What are we going to do without Bud? Well, we could get Superman sick. Get him sick, because all we would need is an actor going, okay. We get him sick. That's good. We get him sick. And we don't need Clark Kent. So what are we going to do? We got to think of something. There's nothing in the comic strip. There's nothing in the comic book. There's nothing there. We're going to have to come up with something." And they did. Superman has superpowers on Earth because the Earth's sun is yellow. Kryptonite's sun was red. Kryptonite didn't have the ability to knock out the radiation from its sun, kryptonite, produced by the sun, and the radiation would be poisonous to all Kryptonians and could kill them. We got it. We got it. Okay, we know what's going on, bud. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Good. We can hire Zach to go. Great. All done. All done. That is how Superman becomes allergic to kryptonite. And there is Bud Collyer looking at the Superman comics. Now, the comics and the radio show didn't exactly sync up with one another because this was done around 1943, and the Superman comic book caught up to the kryptonite problem in 1947. Now, presidents have always had a way, or kind of had a way, of talking directly to the American people. Franklin Roosevelt used radio with his fireside chats, unfiltered. Nobody's asking him any questions. The President of the United States, he could command airtime, even though the people own the frequencies, not Sarnoff, not Paley. It's public airwaves. That's true in TV. It's not true in cable TV because it's a utility. So Roosevelt can say, listen, I want some airtime, and he got it with his fireside chats, telling the nation what he was doing in the 1930s with the Depression. So Franklin Roosevelt goes directly to people. Like I said, anybody who's anybody has a radio show. Now, this slide is from a 1950 Bugs Bunny cartoon, and it's Bugs Bunny's life story. I learned virtually everything in life from Bugs Bunny cartoons and Warner Brothers cartoons, and my wife would probably say the same thing. But when I said anybody who had any talent was on radio, this is what I mean. Al Jolson had a radio show. Of course, Benny had a radio show. Eddie Cantor, Making Whoopee, he had a radio show. Bing Crosby, he had a radio show. These were all big stars, and they all had radio shows. They came into your house at least once a week. So did Abbott and Costello. In fact, Abbott and Costello, Who's on First, became a huge hit while they were second bananas on the Kate Smith Show back in March of 1938. They got the Who's on First skit. Maybe they bought it. Maybe they stole it from a guy by the name of Mike Musto in St. Louis. I have a comic friend by the name of John Joseph. Alan King, if you remember him, was John Joseph's mentor, who claimed that Abbott Costello gave Musto $15. I have another friend, Max Docelli, who spent 40 years being a comic on cruise ships. He said, come on, we're comics. We steal everything. Jerry Lewis stole everything up in the Borscht Belt. He just did it better than anybody else. And they debuted their Who's on First routine on the Kate Smith Show in March of 1938. And the rest, of course, is history. Fred Allen had a show. Victor Borger had a show. Jimmy Durante had a show, along with Gary Moore, who was one of the early stars of network TV in the 1950s. Phil Harris, who was the band leader on the Jack Benny Show. He had a show with his wife, Alice Faye. Bob Hope had a show. You might also tune into things like Amos and Andy, which started on WGN in Chicago in 1927, then went to TV in the 1950s. Burns and Allen, Fibber McGee and Molly, the Goldbergs, the great Gildersleeves, who was referred to as the great Gildersleeves in Bugs Bunny cartoons, and the Inner Sanctum. In fact, the Inner Sanctum, a number of years ago, when I did this live, it's a lot more back and forth here because it's a conversation basically when I do these things live. And anyway, this woman said, oh, the Inner Sanctum, I watched it as a kid. I said, do you enjoy it? She said, oh, she said, me and my sister, we used to go into our room and shut the lights. I said, why'd you shut the lights? Because she said they said so on radio for the best experience listening to the show, shut the lights. And she said she used to hold on to her sister's hand listening to the show because they got so afraid. And I said, well, if you were scared, why'd you listen? She said, because I liked it. Simple. The Inner Sanctum, and of course, there was The Shadow, Lamont Cranston. Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of mankind? shadow knows, Lamont Cranston. And there is Groucho Marx. Groucho Marx had the radio show called You Bet Your Life before it went on television. Also, Blondie, the comic strips, Blondie and Dick Tracy and Gasoline Alley and the Gumps and Little Abner and Little Orphan Annie, who's that little chatterbox, and Popeye the Sailor Man. Also, Ovaltine sponsored the Captain Midnight Secret Squadron. And the guy almost ruined the story for me some time ago. You listened to the show, Captain Midnight Secret Squadron. It was sponsored by Ovaltine. And you wanted to get that ring. You wanted to get that ring. This is a 1945 version of that ring. So that's what you wanted. You wanted the ring. And you wanted to decode the message. There was a message, and they wanted it decoded. That's what they wanted to do. That's what they wanted. And so it was like playing hangman. You got the numbers 1 through 26, and the letters would correspond to various numbers. And so you're playing hangman, and it's about 7, 9, 12, 14 weeks into the show, and you start seeing, hey, wait a minute. There may be an answer here. Well, there was an answer. Drink Ovaltine. That was the answer. Drink Ovaltine. And you were doing this, this, and this. You needed to know that secret squadron message, and you got to drink Ovaltine. Edward R. Morrow joined CBS around 1937. Bill Paley had to form a news department because back in the day, people who were radio announcers just read the newspapers. There were morning newspapers or afternoon newspapers. There were no real news staffs. And the newspaper industry was getting very, very upset at CBS, at Mutual, and NBC, saying, hey, you can't read our newspapers on the air, and we're going to sue you. And so all of the networks that existed in those days that did news said, okay, we will form our own news bureaus. And Bill Paley hired this guy, Edward R. Morrow. He goes to London in 1939, 1940. There's the Blitzkrieg every night in London. That's where the term Morrow's Boys started, because he had Richard C. Hodelet and all these other people working with him. Fernie Fowle, who I met, he was like 100 years old when I met him. I mean, literally, he was 100 years old. And they were all in European theater as part of World War II, before the Americans got into World War II, which was on December 1st, 1941, and that is the USS Arizona in Pearl Harbor. I've been out there a couple of times, and that's the segue, as they say in radio, from Morrow to John Charles Daly and the bombing of Pearl Harbor. There is John Charles Daly. You probably might remember him as the longtime host of What's My Line, a show that went off the air 53 years ago. But he was working at CBS at the time as an announcer in 1941. And he's the guy who reads the bulletin that Pearl Harbor was attacked. Now, this is when life imitates art. He comes on, reads the bulletin. There's an opera, not a dance show, but there's an opera that's going on at the time. And he keeps breaking into the opera. Pearl Harbor has been attacked. We'll have more in a few minutes. And it was back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But this time, it was no fake. These weren't Martians invading New Jersey. This was the United States being bombed and on the verge of war. Arthur Godfrey, he was on for a very, very long time, the old redhead. Now, I worked with Julius LaRosa, who was on the Gottfried Talent Scouts. And Julius LaRosa worked at WNEW Radio in New York. Nice man. I'm 23, 24 years old. He doesn't have to talk to me. Doesn't have to talk to me at all. And I brought up the Arthur Gottfried incident with him where allegedly Gottfried fired him. And Julius LaRosa said, he didn't fire me. He said, I was leaving the show and it was an awkward goodbye. He said, I had nothing against Arthur. I thought I was going to go on and I was going to be a big deal, and I left the show. The only guy from entertainment who visited Arthur Gottfried on his deathbed was Julius LaRosa. The old redhead who played the ukulele had a show on forever. It wasn't forever. It was for about 27 years on the CBS radio network. every morning from 45 to 72, the Arthur Gottfried time, featured his monologues, interviews, music, regular vocalists like Julius LaRosa, sponsored by a cigarette company. And of course, Arthur Gottfried had lung cancer and had a lung taken out. This guy you don't know, Edward Armstrong. He's from Yonkers, New York, and he invented FM radio. And the Yonkers Hall of Fame, this is for Mark Pinto, the Yonkers Hall of Fame is located in the main library in Yonkers, New York on Central Park Avenue. People like Joe Latchick are in there, people like Ella Fitzgerald, people like Sid Caesar are all immortalized in this Hall of Fame. And if you look at that closely, he's in front of a radio board because he invented FM radio, and David Sarnoff would make sure FM radio did not get off the ground. Sarnoff's company, RCA NBC, successfully lobbied the FCC to have the FM spectrum moved from Armstrong's frequencies. He thought 40 to 60 megahertz be perfect for his new radio. The radio that would be clear, there would be no static, and it wouldn't go as far as AM radio, but it was really clear, really clear. And you could listen to records the way records were supposed to be listened to, not with scratches, well, scratches, yes, but not with static. Sarnoff got upset. He thought that Armstrong would kill off NBC radio and kill off AM radio and end his business. Sarnoff had a lot of juice with the Federal Communications Commission and got them to change the frequency from 40 to 60 megahertz to 88 to 108 megahertz on the dial. Armstrong's plan goes awry. Seeking to kill FM before it could threaten his profits, David Sarnoff's company successfully lobbies the FCC to have the FM spectrum moved from Armstrong's frequencies to the one that we use today, 88 to 108. That move occurs on June 27th, 1945, and immediately renders Armstrong's Yankee network, that's what he called it, the Yankee network, obsolete. And people were producing FM radios at the time. RCA wasn't, other companies were. So what Sarnoff effectively did was kill off some of his competition that were producing FM radios. So not only does he kill off Armstrong, but he kills off manufacturers who were putting this out. Your FM radio was worthless. Armstrong dies, he kills himself. He is in lawsuits with Sarnoff for a long time. He goes home and he's so frustrated, he's so upset, he can't deal with it that he strikes his wife. He hits his wife. He goes down to Midtown Manhattan, rents a room in a hotel, one of the highest floors in the hotel that you could get, jumps out the window and kills himself. Sarnoff said, I never killed Armstrong. No, he didn't. But he really ruined Armstrong's business and set back FM radio at least 20 to 25 years. Following Armstrong's death, radio starts leaving us as the most popular medium because television is emerging. World War II is over. The GIs come home. They get their GI Bill. They go to suburbia. They also get television, and television stations are popping up all around the country, and people are going in front of the TV screen, and within, I'm talking about 1946, within 7 years, radio's golden years are behind them. That's Gene Rayburn. You probably know him better from television, from The Match Game and other shows that he did on TV. But Gene Rayburn invented the morning radio show, all the zoos and the Howard Stern. In fact, Howard Stern has said that he used to call himself Gene Rayburn Jr. He at WNEW, my old station, I'm an alum, with a guy by the name of D. Finch, invented what is still heard today in some markets, probably in Philadelphia, as the banter, as this and that. It was Rayburn and Finch. he would leave radio for television. He would become the announcer on the Steve Allen show, and he would host all kind of game shows for Goodson, Todman, and others. He's also involved in the last real radio experiment, something called Monitor, which was on the NBC network, and it was on all weekend. It was people like him and Bill Cohen and Henry Morgan and a whole bunch of other people. The Monitor shows were quite good, and they lasted until the 1970s. The last real radio play or drama was 60 years ago in 1960. What happens to radio? Well, it goes elsewhere. It plays a lot of music, always played a lot of music. There was a guy by the name of Hal Crosley in Cincinnati. He owned WLW Radio, and he had a big band show. And the woman who is the girl singer on the big band show that was on in Cincinnati, 700 on the dial, which I think you could get in Philadelphia, was Doris Day. And Doris Day was replaced by a woman by the name of Barbara Cameron. I know her son, Doug, from cruise ships. Barbara Cameron would go out west and marry a Warner Brothers executive, and she would write the music for the Roadrunner TV show. Roadrunner, the Coyotes After You. So you had music. It moves away from the big band era, moves into top 40 radio. American standards would be a big thing, and eventually FM radio. Alan Freed invented rock and roll, so they say. This is the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland. And he did the Moondog House on the radio station WGW. And it was on at night between 11:15 and 1 a.m. And he was the guy who is credited for taking blues, taking rhythm, taking jazz, putting them all together, and then calling it rock and roll. He spins them, he's hep, that's Freed. And he would, of course, be brought up in the payola scandal in the 1950s and would be convicted, and basically that would be the end of him. Now, he claimed, he said, oh, yeah, I took money from the record companies, why not? I put the records on, these people became more popular, and they made a lot of money off of me. What did I do that was wrong? Well, he took money and played their records. That's what he did that was wrong. A whole bunch of guys were caught in it. Oddly enough, Dick Clark was never caught in the dragnet of payola. Now, that is a 1956 Chevrolet, complete with the Dagmar bumpers. Now, if you don't know who Dagmar is, you got to come and watch my television talk. Dagmar was in fact, Dagmar was the Kim Kardashian of her day, 1949, 1950, 1951. Actually, 1950. She was on a show called Broadway Open House with Jerry Lester, and she had just two assets. And some engineer with General Motors decided that, hey, you know what? Those 1950 cars, the Coupe de Ville, 1956 Chevrolet, we could put these nose cone type things in the bumper, make them look really cool. They were called the Dagmar bumpers. So now you know why Dagmar was the Kim Kardashian of her day, because she only had two assets, immortalized in cars. 1956 Chevrolet, this is the Henry Ford Museum in Detroit. And the 1956 Chevrolet that I took a picture of had only AM radios. It did not have an FM radio. So Armstrong's FM is dead, and car manufacturers, even though there is an FM, 88 to 108, don't bother putting them into cars. That would not happen until the late 1960s. Radios started to have an FM band, and that included an AM band in the late 1950s into the 1960s, but nothing really happened. Although Sandy Koufax, the Los Angeles Dodger pitcher, invested in an FM jazz station in Los Angeles and made some money off of it. FM and rock and roll come together in 1967. In fact, in New York, WNEW FM, that was a Metro Media station, and you had Metro Media Radio in Philadelphia, 610, I know, on the AM dial, and I think it was WMMR in Philadelphia on the FM side for Metro Media. That's who sign my checks, Metro Media. Anyway, I'm in between the L and the I. You can't see me, but I'm standing there between the L and the I. FM and rock came together around 1967. Now, I brought up WNEW-FM because WNEW-FM was rather unusual. They started playing rock and roll music, but they hired 4 women disc jockeys. And for about a year, the only time this has happened in radio history, there were 4 FM disc jockeys spinning records. There were hardly any women who were spinning records, but WNEW-FM was. One of those disc jockeys you might have heard of, Sally Jesse Raphael, and the other was a New York legend by the name of Allison Steele, the Nightbird. Of course, there was news. That's me back in 1979, interviewing then Western New York Congressman Jack Kemp, who was thinking of running for president in 1980. Jack and I had a long relationship until he passed away in 2009. And I showed Jack that picture many years later. And the first thing he said to me is, "What happened to your hair?" I said, "What happened to your wig? It's white now." Kind of relationship I had with Jack Kemp. TV did kill the radio star. There was me when I was 15 years old. Radio lacks importance today, which is unfortunate because we were supposed to have this huge thunderstorm here and they were talking about power outages and all that. Now, if there was a power outage and it lasted, I could not use this, but I could use a radio because radio, you could still walk around with it. I still have a couple transistor radios I leave around the house because I know I could put on the radio and I could get a radio station and I could get information on my area. Radio fragmented into all news. In 1965 in New York, WINS became the first all news station in the United States. KYW in Philadelphia is also all news all the time. It moved into talk, particularly the AM band. They left music behind and had all kinds of talk shows. Today, nobody knows what to do with the AM band. There are frequencies that have been abandoned in small markets because you just can't make any money on radio. And there's some talk about, well, you know, why don't we make the AM band all digital? It'll sound better. Or why don't we apply the same rules to the AM band as we did to the FM band? These are all things that are taken into consideration now. People do listen to their radios still in the car. I have radios all over the place. I never listen to it in the house, although, you know, I could listen to it, I suppose, on the computer and find out what is going on in the various area, my area or your area or someplace else. Radio, there was a lot of work. It was intensive working on radio in the 1920s, 1930s. All those serials, Crime Busters, and all those other serials, they needed talent. Not talent in front of the microphone. You can find that all the time. You needed talent to write out all of the things that went on. Today, unfortunately, there's Clear Channel and there's Entercom, and what Clear Channel does is they voice track. There's one disc jockey sitting somewhere and he just does voice tracks and they send them out to their affiliates. Is there any creativity in radio? Maybe a little bit on NPR, but that's about it. Most stations sound the same. You go to WINS in New York, KYW in Philadelphia, they sound exactly the same. There's no originality in radio anymore. There once was. There isn't anymore. The early days of radio, of course, they're long gone. You're not going to hear War of the Worlds anymore. You're not going to hear the Great Gildersleeves or any of these other shows. In fact, you look at TV these days, what is ABC doing? ABC is bringing back old shows like Name That Tune, which was on radio. I'm waiting for them to bring back the Hit Parade. Matt, thank you so much for inviting me. We'll take some questions or some comments. You can unmute yourself or talk about, or just talk about anything you might remember on radio. I didn't bring up every radio show. I can't do that. we'd be here for 3 weeks. Anybody have any questions or comments? You can put it in chat as well. Anybody remember old time radio? We got somebody? Well, if no questions, I want to thank Matt for inviting me.
Mark, it's Mark.
Okay. Hi, Mark. How are you?
It's Mark, not Matt. Sorry. Yeah.
Go ahead.
You were thanking the wrong person.
I was thanking
Mark Pinto at Phoenixville Library.
Yeah, that's who I was thanking. You.
Yeah. Thank you. But, sorry for mispronouncing your last name.
Oh, don't worry about that. Anybody have anything to say? Oh,
I do.
Okay, go ahead.
I listen to a lot of old radio from the 40s and 50s.
Yeah.
If anybody's interested, the Internet Audio Archive.
Oh, yeah.
Tons of old radio shows.
Yeah, it's, I had a friend, Shelley Saltman, who was beaten up by Evel Knievel, among other things. And he passed away a year and a half ago. He's 87 years old. And he came to one of these talks that I did. And, oh no, I told him about one of the talks. He said, did you ever mention Boston Blackie? I said, no. He said, Boston Blackie was a great detective show. He says, every night I go back to when I was a kid because I have the app. The app is here. And you could listen to the old shows. And he said, it took me back to the 1940s. And he said, I was able to go to sleep really happy because I had something from my childhood that I thought was lost forever that somehow was saved.
Mm-hmm.
When I was a kid, I used to enjoy going to sleep to the radio, but just by scanning through all the channels that I could find and figuring out where they were coming from. And it was just a blast. And it got me interested in radio. Doing radio. So.
It's funny because in the 60s in New York, with my AM radio, I could travel to Pittsburgh and listen to KDKA. I could travel to Charlotte to listen to WBT in Charlotte. I could travel to Baltimore. This was traveling for me. To listen to WBAL, which was 1090 on the dial, or WTIC in Hartford, 1080 on the dial. My favorite was Moncton in Canada, in New Brunswick. That was 1070 on the dial. And let's see, Gina asked, there was a radio show in Philadelphia called Remember When, but it seemed to disappear. Remember When was also in New York as well. We had at WGRC Radio something called The Music of Your Life, which was like Remember When. If you're really interested, there's something called Zoomer Radio in Toronto. It's 740 on the dial. You should be able to get it in Philadelphia. And it's kind of Remember When every night. It's called Zoomer Radio for boomers. And well, the boomers would be the 1950s and 1960s radio. But they kind of try to, in some ways, recreate the radio of those days. But I do remember When it was on in New York. But getting back to radio took me places: Cincinnati, Detroit, Windsor, Ontario. Philadelphia stations didn't come in all that well. WCAU did a little bit. But when I was a kid, I traveled every night to some other city.
I had a shortwave radio that I'd built.
Oh, I had one too.
Yeah, when I was 8 years old, I used to tune into all these stations all over the world.
Yeah, I did too, and that was fun.
Yeah,
See, you had to imagine things that were going on. That's why radio is the theater of the imagination. Anybody else? Well, I want to thank Mark and Amy and Barbara and Brenda and Carl, Gina and iPhone and Kathleen and Lena and Pat and Rita and William Lambert. I feel like I'm on Romper Room, Romper, Stomper, Bumper, Boo. Tell me who. Remember, I forgot who the miss was when I was watching, but I get to see all of you. I want to thank Mark for inviting me. Thank you, Gina, for your kind words. Thank you, Carl, for your kind words. And everybody have a very safe, holiday season. And hopefully we could do this again. Mark, we could do the sister talk to this, the early days of TV.
And this was fun. Thanks so much.
Thank you, and thank everybody. And just want to